Hi guys, good afternoon. Welcome to this last piece of the conference, which is this seminar about the fieldwork methods and their application to the urban life. Obviously, as you may suppose, given the current situation with the coronavirus, we are unable to offer the expected content for this event that was initially planned to be divided into two parts. This theoretical seminar to be celebrated indoors, which is this part I'm presenting now. And then at the evening, a field trip into the Lisbon's nightlife, some kind of a practical exercise with some of us, the organizers, guiding your exploration into the field. So the fun part is not possible to do. So now we can only offer this first part, the seminar. First of all, are you seeing my presentation?
Yes, yes.
Okay. This will be a kind of a brief course on ethnographic methods, which is supposed to last for an hour and a half, with a pause after the first 45 minutes. At the end, we can discuss together some of the contents or your approaches to ethnography and so on. Well, this is the program for today. The first part will be devoted to the historical origins of ethnography, because I think that it's the right way to understand deeply the methodological tools of our discipline. In the second part, we will learn about the epistemological foundation of ethnography in general, which I consider useful for a training about fieldwork, especially for those that are not familiarized with anthropology. And then from the third part on, I will present the specific steps and methods of ethnographic research. As you can see, this is kind of a traditional course, maybe too much familiar for many of you, but we are trying with this to introduce ethnography to the beginners. We know that some of you are students, so we think that it's important to have these basic notions of collecting data in the field. So this is the idea for today. So in order to understand ethnography today, which, as you know, is widely present in other social sciences in these days, not just ethnography, it's necessary to learn its origins, its consolidation as a key method for anthropology. As you may know, also modern sociology and modern anthropology were born around the 19th century, following the development of state institutions, mostly in the Western capitalist countries. Also, as you know, the roots of social thought may be localized in the Enlightenment philosophers of the 18th century. Sociology, in the case of sociology, is especially devoted to understand our own modern industrial states. Sociology, in fact, was born through the work of philosophers, intellectuals of the 19th century, concerned about the political foundation, the practical administration of these new modern states that were created after the bourgeois revolutions in the 18th century, especially the American Revolution and the French Revolution. You have to imagine those times. You have to imagine this emerging necessity of a thought about society during the changes related to industrial revolution, when the cities grow exponentially, when the migration from the countryside to the cities changed the demographic equilibrium of all Western societies, and also when a huge amount of Europeans left their countries for 100 years to go to America, into countries where the new bourgeois republics, these new bourgeois republics, substituted the domination of imperial absolute monarchies from Europe. So the question for these first sociologists was, what kind of new societies are emerging after all these changes we experienced in the last part of 18th century and during the 19th century? These intellectuals started to think about a science able to predict the social phenomena and organize the state with efficiency in this new situation. Most part of them were involved, as you know, these sociologists, in the not just in the thinking of government, but also in in the political evolution of their countries. But what about the anthropology? Well, at the same time, these Western capitalist countries dominated territories abroad, the colonies, the enclaves, where we have these then called primitives or savages used to live in these colonies. In this sense, anthropology was born from the need to understand African political systems in order to manage efficiently the colonies. The belief of Native Americans to convert them to Christianity, or the reciprocity or the economic forms that they found in the Pacific Islands to introduce mercantilism and the modern forms of exchange. This is obviously the sad and controversial origin of anthropology, a science completely related, linked to the reality of colonial administration and exploitation. In fact, the first theoretical approach in anthropology, which is the evolutionism, was at the service, the direct service of the political interest of colonialism, sharing, in fact, its same ideology. Evolutionists thought that the history of humankind followed a linear evolution from the most primitive people, those that were animists, nomads with simple technological tools and no forms of government, to the most impressive form of society, which was the society of these sociologists and anthropologists, the industrial, capitalist country, highly specialized, technically impressive, which is based on science and also morally tied to the Christian Protestant values. Of course, that if we follow this idea, as they follow, the moral imperative of white colonialists was obviously to educate these backward societies in order to help them reach the standard of our own society. This is an ideology that is very present today in our practices and in our thought, as some academics, some scholars, that the decolonial activism, activists and also authors strive every day to demonstrate us, that we are still a colonial, we are still in a colonial mode of thought. But what about the fieldwork, which is our interest today? Well, these first anthropologists, these evolutionist anthropologists, were a little lazy. Don't you see these guys there? They didn't practice ethnography. They didn't go to the field. Anthropological thought was mostly produced through a network of information, a network of informants, some kind of a mailing system between these urban intellectuals in their comfortable offices in the West and the colonialists that were in the field, military officials, missionaries, government representatives, and also traders, businessmen that were in contact with other societies in the colonies. As a consequence, the information collected by the first anthropologists regarding other societies was often taken from direct reports of many different people who were poorly trained in observation methods and in social thought, or not trained at all. After all, evolutionary anthropologists were not interested in the diversity, in the particular diversity of human groups that these colonialists discover in the overseas territories, but in using this information of particular groups for making general appreciations and theoretical models about the many shapes that society takes in this evolutionary journey from the most primitive state to our days. This reasoning, you can notice that is still present today. For instance, when some people think about forms of government, we usually say we are in democracies, but they, who knows who are they, are still in authoritarian forms of government. We have this legacy of evolutionism is very present in our way of thought in different fields. Well, in short, there were no major interest in the particularities and own value of other cultures during this first stage of anthropology. However, we have to acknowledge that evolutionary anthropologists create for the first time in history a huge register of alive human cultures. And this is a key word for us in ethnography, culture, which is central in Papua New Guinea and also in the urban night, as we will see later. Why this happened this way? Because anthropologists need to know the reality of social, political, economic, religious organization of social groups different from their own. And this is the original difference with sociologists. And that's why we, anthropologists, stick to the idea of culture. Well, this idea of culture is very important to understand fieldwork. In spite of the controversies around the definitions of this word, which are a lot, this word culture, that in fact confront different schools of thought and traditions inside the anthropology, we could define culture as a set of practices, signifiers, technologies that are shared and transmitted through any social group, and that articulates its everyday life. In fact, and this is the relation of culture with ethnography, ethnography literally means the profession of writing about a specific culture, ethnos and graphia. As a method of qualitative research on the field, ethnography consists in staying among the studied group in order to examine directly and register in a systematic way in field notes the practices, the signifiers, these technologies that are at the base of any social group. Many times, often, the researcher assumes an active role in observation, speaking with the social actors and even asking for explanations and interpretations about what's going on in the field. This is the so-called participant observation. We can say that there's no better method to provide us data about human behavior in society. But what about the origins, not of anthropology, but the origins of ethnography? Well, we saw that evolutionary anthropologists were now interested in the particular cultures their informants encountered in the colonies. However, at the same time, the first manifestations of ethnography in a scientific way started to be practiced in Russia and also in the German traditions. But maybe the most well-known event of this type of science in those times was the collective expedition of the Torres Strait between Australia and Papua New Guinea, organized by the University of Cambridge in 1898. For several months, psychologists and physicists, because there were no formal education in anthropology yet in those times, these psychologists and physicists did the first modern fieldwork with the idea of systematically register and gather materials from other cultures. They made the first anthropological films and also registered sounds, songs and legends with wax cylinders. Despite these precedents, the father of modern ethnography is another name, which was actually educated in the London School of Economics by some of the members of this Torres Strait expedition. We are obviously talking about Bronislaw Malinowski. Malinowski changed the paradigm on studying other cultures after he was trapped in the Western Pacific Trobriand Islands when the First World War began, keeping him there for many months. This experience of being trapped there pushed him to systematize a method of inquiry based on fieldworks and intensity and participation in the life of the natives. This participant observation we saw before. We can say that Malinowski is not the inventor or the creator of ethnography, but it's the creator of participant observation, because he theorized about participant observation. According with Malinowski, it was necessary to move beyond these old practices of anthropology. Anthropology should be made in presence, not by mail. We cannot rely on the reports of others. We must know on the first hand about these cultures we are studying. Malinowski's approach to fieldwork is somehow sensed as actual today, as valid today. There are three methodological pillars according to Malinowski. Observation of everyday life, not just exotic practices, which was a common use in the past. Participation in the lives of people in order to gain their trust. And data collection to document ritual, kinships, and economics. A massive amount of information. He was a positivist. The objective is being accepted in the group, learn the worldview of natives, and then understand the rules and institutions structuring their lives. As I said, Malinowski was a positivist and also a functionalist. In fact, he's considered the founding father of functionalism. This means that he understood social groups as they were alive organisms, where all the parts are connected and fulfill natural functions to survive. So functionalists imagine society as an organism. Functionalism is today kind of an old and surpassed theory, considered a theory that is not able to, is not useful to understand societies today, because view societies as isolated unities, very harmonic inside with all the components, very coordinated, but without internal conflicts or influences from outside. Why I'm saying that? Because somehow ethnography, in spite of functionalism being an old theory, is still very much tied to functionalism and to this idea of the interconnection of the elements of any given society. We will see later this relation between ethnography and functionalism in how we practice the connection of ideas in the context of the fieldwork. Another important historical find of anthropology that has been influencing the practice of ethnography is this big challenge that is still today a problem of giving up of ethnocentrism. The anthropologists figured out soon that in order to understand societies different from our own societies, it was necessary to abandon the ethnocentrism in benefit of cultural relativism. Ethnocentrism, basically, you may understand, is setting our ethnos, which means our culture, in the center. Interpret, evaluate other cultures using our reference, our moral, intellectual references of our own values, our own prejudices. Cultural relativism is the opposite exercise. It means contextualizing the traits of a culture, the elements, the circumstances of each culture, in order to be able to compare them from a neutral point of view, at least morally neutral, which was an exercise of 100 years for Western societies. Well, I would like to introduce here the second source of ethnography, historical source, and it's the anthropologist that popularized, in fact, this discussion on cultural relativism, is Franz Boas. Franz Boas, a German Jew that migrated to New York in 1896, in the 19th century, in the last 15 years of the 19th century. It's the founding father of American cultural anthropology, which is another tradition. As a German, he brought ideas from his country's intellectual tradition that challenge, in fact, evolutionism. For example, cultural diffusionism, which is the idea that human migration and exchanges are the vectors of mutual influence and cultural change. And also the idea of historical particularism, which is a derived idea, the subsequent idea that each society is unique, is a product of historical circumstances and influences. This is a challenging for in the times of evolutionism, that were people who thought about societies as a linear evolution, a necessary and automatic evolution. Think again in this idea of the forms of government. Each society is unique. There is no necessity to go through the same forms of government because the history of each country is somehow unique. But, okay. Following these ideas, Franz Boas and her disciples concentrated their ethnographic efforts on documenting and preserving the remaining of Native American cultures during the first half of the 20th century, during the expansion of modern American urban culture. However, these ethnographic expeditions were made following the spirit of Torres Strait rather than the Malinowskian method. They were short expeditions, collective expeditions, and mostly centered in collecting materials, collecting legends, collecting kinship. It was only in 1928 that American cultural anthropology started its own tradition on modern ethnography with the work of Margaret Mead, which is this girl between two Samoan girls in the island of Samoa when she was only 26 years old something like that. But with these examples I gave you so far, one important question arises, because it's now 5:30, for those who want to study the night. Is ethnography a suitable method to understand non-Western cultures? Can we apply these methods to our own urban context, or is this a disconnection between this method and the kind of data that we have in modern culture? Actually, the development of ethnography and fieldwork methods was simultaneous in exotic contexts and in our own contemporary cities during the 19th century and the 20th century. There are many examples of individual researchers in the 19th century, often advocates of social reform, that made systematic observation in, for example, the private neighborhoods, or even in the factories in the context of industrial labor, documenting the life of workers and also the urban poor, this in the 19th century. However, the roots of urban ethnography, and here is the third and last example of, not example, the last source of modern ethnography that we will present today. The roots of urban ethnography are associated to the city of Chicago in the decade of 20 of the 20th century. Oops, okay. The city has been growing exponentially for the last 50 years until becoming I think the third most populated city in the 20th century, in the beginning of the 20th century. Also, Chicago became the main point of attraction for many workers coming from all over the world during this golden age of American industrial development. This turned Chicago into a melting pot, this famous expression that means this reunion of many nationalities and ethnic groups living together, but also segregated in different districts, which was one of the initial interests of the Chicago school that we are presenting. It's also here that we find the origins of the 1st of May as the International Workers' Day. It was during a strike claiming for the 8-hour working day in 1886 that some workers were murdered by the Chicago police, and later the Second International claimed this day as the International Workers' Day, and so on. So you can imagine that Chicago was at those times a kind of social laboratory where study social change in motion, the patterns of socialization in these new ethnic enclaves with people from all around the world, the transformations, the very quick transformations of neighborhoods and the growing of different, what they call at those times, moral environments, the moral environments that the Chicago scholars talk in those times. Well, in this exciting atmosphere, the School of Chicago was born, founded by the first guy in the left, William Isaac Thomas, that studied the lives of Polish peasants that migrated to the United States using their personal documents and testimonies as data to analyze this process of migration. This first work of William Isaac Thomas means the origin of the migration studies and also the peasant studies. It was a moment of sociological thinking very important for many subdisciplines today. But the most important character in this story about ethnography is the guy in the middle, Robert Ezra Park, the theoretical father of the Chicago School, that emphasized that research, sociological research in urban context, must be done as anthropologists did in the exotic context. That's it, direct and systematic study of social life. He was a journalist first, and he was known as a very wild journalist that was always when the action occurred in the streets. Well, the disciples of this school did many ethnographies in different areas of Chicago or about different urban phenomena, but here I want to talk about one of the very first ethnographies centered on the night that many of you may know. The Taxi Dance Hall by Paul Cressy, a study about the lives of women that dance with men for money in specific venues, these dance halls. These women were no prostitutes, okay? It's common confusion. But they live in the night world, and sometimes biographies could drift to prostitution. They were just poor migrant women that earn more money in this occupation than working in a factory. Here we have a photograph of the 40s, but you must remind that this ethnography was in the 20s, just to contextualize. Well, now you have pretty much an idea of the three sources of ethnography historically, and some of the most important events in the formation of ethnographic thought, ethnographic theory, ethnographic practice. So I want now to discuss with you, before entering into the particular tools of ethnography and talking about the design of the research and the observation and so on, I want to talk about the epistemological principles of ethnographic exploration, having always in mind a question that maybe people put to you when doing ethnography sometimes. Is it science? What kind of knowledge are we creating in ethnography? So what we are able to say to this point about these epistemological principles of ethnography from the perspective of our practice as ethnographers is that ethnography is situated. In fact, we can define fieldwork as the systematic study of ordinary events and activities of any given social group or social space in situ. This principle of being there, discovered by Malinowski, is central in order to notice what's the meaning of these activities and events for the people involved, and also understand the perspective of participants in the situation. This is basically the most important thing in ethnography. This is only possible to understand this meaning of the situations, being there with people. Situations and contexts are paramount to understand society, because often people, you can notice this when you are in the field, assume particular roles and attitudes depending on where they are. They assume roles when they are as the bar owners, and then after, when the bar closes, they are another person. So we need to be there to check this kind of changes. Second, ethnography is detailed. The most part of our work is to write good depictions about what's going on, about the situations we are witnessing, and the conversations we had with people in their context. We observe, we listen, we register an assorted variety of discourses, events, and situations, generating qualitative data about this direct contact we have with the situation. Ethnography is non-abstractive. Unlike other kind of studies also performed in the field, such, for example, the field test made by biologists, for example, plant biologists, the social researcher should be as respectful as possible with the everyday events that are being observed, trying to don't disrupt it. It is interesting to notice that biologists in a field, in terms of epistemology of science, try to do the opposite. They cause interactions between the elements to measure the alterations they arouse. This relation between the elements arouse. Ethnography is systematic. This is not just about visiting a social context or a group of friends and talking to random people. It is about collecting data in a systematic way. We observe in particular moments to see specific things happening because we have a plan. We interact and speak with particular people to obtain unique perspective that we are seeking for. And also we do that for a long time, ideally for years, which is the common practice among anthropologists. However, and this is important, in spite of our efforts to systematize our research, to be systematic doing fieldwork, ethnography often becomes a chaotic, emotional, and even a dangerous process. Why is that? Because ethnography is mainly a social interaction. In the fieldwork, we are at the same time a social researcher, and this is very different in other sciences, and also a human being involved in a complex set of interpersonal relationships. That's why our personality, our social skills are paramount to understand not our success, but the position we will take in the context where we are being introduced. sometimes the students are worried about this influence of their personalities in the field. But there's no reasons to be worried about our social skills, because it's the same that in our social lives. There are researchers who get along with people very quickly, but there are others that need time, but sometimes reach a deeper level with people in order to understand more deeper levels of personality and involvement with the field. Of course, that also our statuses, our age, our gender, sexual orientation, ethnicity, social class, all that is visible or expressed through our bodies are very present in our interaction, and as a consequence could affect at how are we received in particular social context. Finally, ethnography is flexible. We said, of course, that ethnography must be systematic in the determination to collect data, to plan, to register our thoughts, as we will see later, but must be also flexible regarding our own planning and scheduling, because there's no a standard list of things to be registered in the field. We are naked in the field the first time, or there are no sets of questions to be posed in any given interview or interaction. They must be new. Somehow the methodologies are new for its research, created from scratch, because these methodologies must be adapted to the social world and to the position we take when entering there, according with who we are. That's the reason ethnography could be an ambiguous and creative and confusing exercise, not recommended to those used to apply strict methodologies coming from, for example, quantitative methodology. So we saw these main features of ethnography from the perspective of our practice. I think that this could be useful, could be a useful list to remember to ourselves the essence of our work in the field. But what happened with the foundations of this knowledge? Let's go now to a more complicated questions. What kind of data are we collecting? Is fieldwork reasoning and interpretation part of the scientific endeavor? We are colleagues with field biologists, for example, or is this something different? Well, fieldwork, it's not deductive, it's inductive. As you know, the most accepted method of reasoning to obtain scientific knowledge is deduction. Deduction is a process of thinking that goes from the generalities to the particular cases, in case you didn't remember the philosophy classes. In other words, the deduction uses general laws, general principles, already known principles, to deduce what could happen in particular unknown cases. An example, a very stupid example, but easy example. First enunciate, the fishing communities are superstitious, the people in the fishing communities. Second enunciate, the people from, put here a name of a fishing town. I will put Sesimbra, which is a town here in Portugal, which is a people. Second enunciate, the people from Sesimbra are a fishing community. As a consequence, following the logic of deduction, people from Sesimbra are superstitious. We don't need experience with this model to conclude this final assumption that will be true if the first two enunciates are true. An evolution of this deductive reasoning is the hypothetical deductive model or experimental model, which sustained the scientific method with some evolutions from the 17th century to our days. In this model, we have the hypothesis. You work with hypotheses, isn't it? Which are the hypotheses predictive assumptions based on a deductive argument. So we are waiting for a response of yes or no to our hypothesis, isn't it? But in this case, this hypothesis must be subjected to an experiment or an observation to be verified, to be corroborated. Well, deductivism, this model of deductivism, is very useful to verify or neglect existing theories in science and also in our practice of social science. But it's not open enough to create new approaches, to imagine new ways to understand social worlds, because the unique response to an hypothesis is yes or no. The hypothesis is a closed question. That's why the typical way of reasoning in our fieldwork is the induction. And inductive, and this is, I'm talking about that because this is the response you have to do, you have to offer to those who are challenging ethnography as a site. Well, the typical way of reasoning in fieldwork is induction. An inductive approach try to start a research with no predictive assumptions, with no closed hypothesis to be verified with a yes or a no. Because assumptions, these assumptions that are the hypothesis, could easily become prejudices that blind us to see the complexity of any given social world. Okay? We need to go to the field with an open mind. This is the idea of the fieldwork, because we are willing to be guided by the empirical world in order to build our own theoretical orientations that, remember, are always new somehow. How we do that? Well, we need to, first of all, avoid this setting of the problem as a closed hypothesis to be verified with regular scientific protocols, like 50 interviews to demonstrate an assumption. Our ethnographic gaze must remain permanently open and flexible, because we are interested in depicting a social world with all their details and nuances, and also with all the contradictions that we find in the field. Inductive research don't verify just the hypothesis. It's even more flexible, because we verify the whole components of the research all the time. Our concepts, our methodologies, our doubts and problems are integrated. We incorporate our questions to be discussed in the research, okay? Obviously, this is an extreme situation. This rigorous differentiation is rare to find in research. Obviously, all researchers contain deductive elements, our intention to verify previous theories, and also inductive elements. We create some exploratory knowledge and new ideas while doing field. Well, I don't know if any of you is alive still after this short introduction to deductionism, but I promise that after that it's easier to follow. Even the appearance of these words, because ethnography is not nomothetic, it's ideographic. Nomothetic are the seeking for laws. One of the most important goals of science is the creation of solid, long-lasting laws that resist experimentation, resist this proof of experimentation. If it's possible, that must be irrefutable. This is the goal of a scientist. Make a law that lasts for 200 years. These laws offer explanations of several problems. You know that the trajectories and speed of falling objects, or the movement of celestial bodies, and so on. However, in the fieldwork, we have objects of study, the people, their societies, that are extremely complex and unable to be contained in such a logic. In the fieldwork, we are not interested in this nomothetic objective, which is create laws, validate hypotheses, control the variables, but in the exploration and description and understanding of particular social realities, sometimes unique realities, which is the same goal as history, for example. We assume that the scientific endeavor or the humanistic endeavor of history is to depict unique situations that will not be won't be repeated. Well, this one maybe you know. Ethnography is not explanatory; it's interpretative. Just a moment. Vale. Okay. When we analyze the data collected in the social world, or the discourses that give by the people, by social actors in our interviews, we cannot get causal explanations easily. In the most part of cases in our work, the data collected, the raw data collected in the field is analyzed through the available body of knowledge, of previous knowledge about this issue, by the researcher's subjective interpretation. For example, we can theorize, and it's very common in urban studies, theorizing about the inclination of urban poor population to participate in drug dealing, for example. It's a very common situation, describe it and analyze it in many ways. How we do that? How we create knowledge from this impression we have about this participation of urban poor in drug dealing? Well, we don't create an explanatory law, like if there's people who do that. But for example, an explanatory law looks like that. If the familiar income of these people falls below $200, automatically the younger members of the family enroll in drug dealing. This is absurd, isn't it? Society doesn't work like that. Why create a science that works like this is economic laws? And like that, what we do, we can use our interpretation skills to put together a theory on how the elements of economic constraints, the racial segregation, the experience of police abuse, and the stigmatization of particular neighborhoods, or even the taste of young people in these neighborhoods for gangster movies and gangster fictions could lead some young people to informal economy as the only way to survive in a particular context. This is a way to interpret and not to explain things. Well, this one is the easier. Another factor contributing to this general underestimation of fieldwork in some circles of knowledge is the lack of quantifiable data, of big numbers, of numbers at least that we can analyze using sophisticated statistical tools. Fieldwork is featured by the accumulation, description, classification of qualitative data, historical contextualizations, informal conversations, in-depth interviews, discourse analysis, dense descriptions, and so on. Later, we will see some of these tools and instruments of our work. Ethnography or fieldwork is not segmented, it's holistic. Fieldwork could be centered, and many times is centered, around a very particular reality. We study sometimes very particular realities, but we never divide this reality in particular problems, as this reality could be isolated and separated from the whole social life. All the sciences, again, try to verify their hypothesis precisely in this way, isolating a phenomenon from its context to observe how it reacts when we change some variable. And like this, in the fieldwork, we recognize how all the elements overlap, intersect to each other, because there's no possibility to isolate an element as if it's not connected to the whole. We must understand how all the elements of any given society are connected. This is, in fact, what I talk about the functionalist legacy on ethnographic methods and on anthropological epistemology. A good example to understand is the European football, the soccer. Looking at the world of soccer, we can understand how our societies work, not just how football or soccer work. For example, the representation of normative masculinities, the cult of the body, the cult for celebrities, the rise of national identities and nationalism, the invisibilization of LGTB identities. These are not features of soccer, but of the whole society where soccer is inserted. We call this holism, which is this interrelation of all the elements in the most little element we are studying. And finally, ethnography is not neutral, it's reflexive. Experimental and natural sciences are allegedly neutral. There's no ideology, nothing but experimentation and truth in them. Well, the philosophy of science and the sociology of knowledge are two specializations devoted to deny this absurd but widely accepted principle. This is not the place, we have no time now to discuss this, but in our case, we cannot even imagine ethnography without the subjectivity of the researcher and its personal and unique way of entering into the field, of dealing with people, of interpreting the data. Often, these sociologists and anthropologists in their own ethnographies are reflexive. What does that mean? How we can be reflexive in our ethnographies? Reflexivity consists on reflecting about our role of researchers in the context of our work. So the question is, how do we produce knowledge in the context of the field? How I am obtaining information and context here? Is the people aware? Are the people aware of my intentions? What's our involvement with the context? Am I contributing somehow to this community, or I'm just extracting information for my university or whatever funding organization, or for my thesis, etc. In short, the only way to be neutral for us is to be aware of the many problems and contradictions of our practice, asking constantly ourselves these questions and writing about them in our works. Okay? We don't accept this neutrality. We assume that we are biased. Well, a more interesting part for you, I guess, must be this more practical thing about research, design, and ethics. Now that we are aware of the origins and the epistemological foundations of ethnography, let's think a little about the design of our researches, the modalities that we can assume when entering the field, and also the ethical problems that we have to tackle, especially at night. Now we are going to talk more about the night, and especially things that I think all you have encountered in your fields. An important moment when we are designing our research is documentation. This must be an ongoing process. We are documenting about our object of study before, during, and after the fieldwork. It is not a stage that we left behind. Okay, what kind of documents we check? First of all, even when we are studying a modern nightlife district, it is important to be aware of the historical dimensions of our context. What about the past of this district? We must ask ourselves about the past of the district. When it became a nightlife district, which actors were involved with this transformation? Private investors, the city council, how the ambience of the night changed through time in this area. And also the users, people visiting this place at night, are the same sectors of society in the 80s and now? What changed through time? In short, we need to know about the history of our neighborhood or town or a specific venue or a specific festival or nightlife area. But it's not just having this information simply to write a brief historical introduction to the place in our articles, which is very common in many articles. It's about understanding the deep connections that often exist between the process of transformation in the past and the current development of social life in any given space. A second advice in terms of documenting is to read about not only all the literature produced about our particular context of study, which of course you must know thoroughly, but also about other similar contexts, districts, and venues. If you are writing a piece about particular venues where Latin American migrants meet to dance salsa in Paris, for example, then it is necessary to read about the same kind of places everywhere in the world. It's almost mandatory. And then also extend our reads beyond, to open our mind to other expressions about, for example, dancing meetings in general, people who wrote about general meetings, meetings for dance. And also even to, why not, about the physiological mechanism of dancing, about what happened in the brain when we dance, or about nightlife venues in general in this area, and so on. While reading about our object, the first ideas and theories and assumptions about the world we are about to study begin to accumulate in our mind. That's why it is necessary to make a simple exercise to assess our emotional and moral opinions and our possible baseline prejudices that exist in our mind. This is called the auto-analysis, and we have to answer basically three questions. Which is the process that led us to the project? Sometimes we're interested in an object of study that is already part of our lives. It happens a lot, such as our neighborhood, that happens to be a nightlife district, or our work. We are working in a club, or we worked in a club in the past. when we are young, or our leisure time. We are clients of this venue. We like this kind of music. We like this kind of ambiences. But could be also the opposite. We felt always out of place in nightlife, or maybe we are not drinkers, and we think that it's interesting to look at people making crazy things while they are drunk. Maybe it's just that the nightlife noise problems are central to the public discussion in our town, or we read some interesting reflections in the newspaper, or our professors pointed at this issue to us to do a work. Whatever the case may be, we have to trace back our involvement with this object of study. A second question for the autoanalysis is, which are our first ideas about the object of study or the context or so on. Here we must find our own prejudices and preconceptions. It is important to know that every researcher, we said before that we are reflexive, we are not assuming neutrality. Every researcher starts with some prejudices that are product of our position in the social world, our identities, our political views. Everyone has this kind of mental baseline. We cannot avoid having prejudices. It's just that we must be aware of them and working on surpassing them during the research. The research is the space for surpassing these prejudices. So, what's my opinion on this issue? This is a question for us. What's my opinion on this issue? For example, a classic one, the right to have leisure versus the right to the rest of neighborhoods is a classic one. What's my feeling when I see this fancy new bar opening in a former working class district? Or am I comfortable when I see people drug dealing or taking drugs inside a venue? Why? Why I have this emotional reaction or political view about the practices of others? And the third question to ask to ourselves is, which are the ideas or conclusions we want to reinforce in our work? Here we must assess our own ideology, our political thinking directly, the issues we want finally that our work ends to defend or attack. Maybe we are studying urban nightlife to fight against the sexual objectification of women's bodies in the ads and flyers of clubs, and also in the policies to hire waitresses in some venues, or maybe to denounce the excess of nightlife noise and the consequences of the gentrification of some districts, or you want to make a sounding defense of the particular ambience of some underground places where the young working class release their everyday tensions, dancing and partying. Whatever the case, these starting positions must be calibrated, must be balanced in order to exchange, to be capable of exchanging ideas with other visions on the same issues. We must be what's the term? Well, we must be open to other visions on the same issue. So it's necessary to identify which is our starting position. Following the same ideas about challenging this conception of a neutral, objective, and aseptic fieldwork, it is necessary to remind that we are working with people, and we must be responsible and aware of our actions and responsibilities regarding how we behave and collect data in the field. So we will see now two different interrelated problems that you certainly will find in your work at night. First, the question of the undercover research, okay? And then the question of asking for consent when we are in the field. These are the bigger questions in contemporary discussion about ethics in research. Well, as you can imagine, undercover research is not acceptable, okay? Today it's not acceptable according with the deontological codes of social science, because we cannot collect data without the consent of people. However, it is not easy to deal with this general principle because there are several blurry areas in what we do as ethnographers in social context. Of course, that everyone agrees that it is wrong to enter into a context or into a private social group, avoiding to tell people we are conducting a study, and then after some time we just disappear and publish some text talking and unveiling intimate details of their lives. We all agree that this is wrong. However, the most part of situations in a fieldwork are more tricky. For example, in the case of Nightlife, we are usually in spaces of public and semi-public access, often crowded or sometimes crowded with people, where this duty of announcing every time our presence as researchers, repeating to everyone, I'm doing a research, seems inappropriate, seems it's difficult to apply. Our observations and responsibility in these kind of places are similar to, for example, a music journalist that came to write an article about a live concert inside the venue and describe with detail the vibe in the venue, the spirit of the assistants, and some conversation she or he heard. However, we as ethnographers go farther. Usually we go farther and deeper in these observations because we don't go to this venue just for this concert. We are constantly there. And so we get to know people. An important rule to follow when we present ourselves to people is that we must be careful about what we say and what we do not say about our study. For example, we rarely disclose this deepest implication of our work, this theoretical idea that is in the background of our work. When, for example, we are being presented to the local artists that are the owners of a particular hype space in the nightlife, it's not necessary to tell them that according to our theoretical framework, their practices of activism in the neighborhood are actually and paradoxically beneficial to capitalism through marginal gentrification. So it's very rare to do. Or maybe we can do that. We can have this conversation. It depends on how we see our relationships in the context that will also change through time. Again, it's the same that in social life. We are not completely sincere and transparent to everyone. We learn to play our cards, being respectful with people, but we are not all the time talking about us. However, if we are working, and this is a little exception, which position is our and the informant, if we are working with vulnerable people in the night, such as sexual workers, drug dealers that carry out illegal or considered illegal prosecuted activities, we must be more cautious. We will talk about this later, but a general rule must be respected. We don't harm and don't get harmed in our interactions with people and institutions during the fieldwork. The second problem regarding ethical procedures in fieldwork is the consent form. I'm sure that most part of us heard about this consent form. As you may know, during the last decade, the European Commission and other funding institutions have been publishing recommendations and also mandatory instructions for researchers on how to behave during the process of collecting data in social research. This obviously, this is very closely related with the issue of undercover research. The most relevant element is this informed consent form, a document that must be signed by people that we contact to interview. If you are a student, it's not necessary yet to be worried about this kind of questions. This is more for researchers with larger and funded projects, especially funded by national or European agencies. Here is a model. You can see an informed consent form. It's a fake university. It's a fake project. It's just a model to you see the informed consent. The main problem with this kind of forms is that in ethnography, again, this is trickier. Often the most important moments and opportunities to collect data are not only the interview settings where the research meet privately with a subject in a room with an audio recorder and some time to talk isolated. In ethnography, we gather situations, we gather testimonies, impressions, comments on the fly, produced by and inside a situation. A material that often is not repeatable in this aseptic context of a guided or semi-guided interview. And this is a problem. Returning to these former examples, sexual workers or drug dealers will never accept to sign a paper to talk, well, not never, because we can develop very intimate relations with some of them, and we can sometimes get them to sign these kind of papers. But in general, it's difficult. We'll seldom accept to sign a paper to talk about their activities, even when we are declaring in the same paper, in the same form, that their identities will not be disclosed. In short, we have to get these declarations signed. But in the meantime, we can start informal relationships with people in the context, which is the main source of information at the beginning of our research. And later, we can interview them with these declarations, closing the circle of collecting data. In any case, the basic principle, as I said before, is do not harm people, do not harm their relationships, their jobs in the context, not only during the fieldwork, but later with which is our main weapon, our principal weapon, the writing and the publishing. This is our main weapon. That's why pseudonyms exist, as you know, but in some cases are not enough synonyms. That's why, for example, how can we make an interesting description of a context when we want to conceal the location of the neighborhood we are talking about? How do we describe this particular neighborhood? Everyone knows which is the neighborhood we are talking about. How can we, for example, reveal and denounce obscure power relations or abuses we find without exposing our informants in the field? These are real and authentic ethical problems in ethnography, which is basically an equilibrium of different responsibilities that we must learn to balance, because there is no an easy solution for that. It's an equilibrium we must achieve. Responsibility first towards research participants. We already said that. This is central. Don't harm, protect, anonymize, and assure confidentiality, which is at the same time in some situations troublesome, because, for instance, we are supposed to report a crime that we find out during the fieldwork. So, which is the limit here between being ethnographers or act like cops or social assistants, for example? We have social and political responsibility also in our researchers. As we said before, often there is a political engagement. Our study seeks to denounce some situations of inequality, for example, or favoring a marginalized group and so on. The assumption of this responsibility could perfectly collide with other responsibilities, such as neutrality, or even our personal safety, which is very appropriate in the night. Some contexts could be dangerous for the researcher. When we study any context, we are aware of the power relations and inequalities between the members of any given society or any given social group. And this could be annoying for those holding the power. We can find problems when we disclose these power relations. Also, when studying nightlife context, we must be extra careful when exploring some places at some hours or talking to particular people and groups, as you probably know. We have more responsibilities towards our informants and allies. Who are there? These are specific members of the society that help us to be accepted in a place or in a group. They are somehow our mentors in the place we are studying, and they could be victims of our actions because they are seen by the others as related to us. This happens usually when the publication comes out. When we publish our results, society could search for a responsible for the filtering of this information, for the leak of information, and this is our ally, our informant. We must be aware of this responsibility. And finally, we have a responsibility towards the funding agencies and the gatekeepers. Usually, we have signed an agreement with our supervisor, for example, with the university or with the funding agency about what we will do in the field. But often our interests, our approaches change over time. So we must report these changes. And also with the gatekeepers. Who are the gatekeepers in a research? The gatekeepers, you will understand immediately, are the individuals we must visit before being incorporated in any given context. For example, the president of an association, the principal, if we are doing research in a school, or the owner of a bar that see us all the day taking notes in his or her bar. She or he is asking us, what are you doing here? So we need to talk with these gatekeepers. In more informal contexts, there's also leading figures from whom we need to obtain some sort of acceptance at the beginning of the research. There's always gatekeepers, right? This leads us to the next important issue, and we are now finishing the first part of this presentation, more or less. Entering the field. We have pointed out the importance of documentation, the auto-analysis, the problems with undercover research, and also the consent forms. But the first visit to the field, the first time we are there and get to know people, is even more critical. It's a unique moment when we can realize, for example, if we welcome, if we are comfortable in the environment, and also if we can get any ally in the context. The first impression in terms of appearance and attitude is important. We want to become more or less camouflaged, more or less blend with the atmosphere. So it's recommended not to break the social conventions of dressing in the new environment. Regarding behavior, we must be cautious, not asking for important questions until we understand more about the position of the different actors, about the issue we are studying. Our position must be at the beginning some sort of innocent, in a position of learning about the context. Okay? Well, so now I thought about the idea of having two different blocks for observation and for interviewing. Maybe in order to, it's too long, but maybe I cut some parts that are not super important, but well, let's start with the next section. The next section is starting to think and talk about the empirical qualitative methodologies, particular of the fieldwork. The first one, observation. Ethnographic observation is the product of three interrelated techniques: perception, memorization, and noting down, writing down. Three qualities that will be improving during the research, because the more observations we do, the better the descriptions we write down. This is a question. This is like a technique occupation. So we can perceive how we are learning and improving in our technique. However, we don't rely only on observation. We will talk after that about the interviews and the conversations. We must go also with interviews and informal conversations to capture the meanings and the participant perspective on social life. Giving up of interactions with people and just observe in settings, which is a temptation for the beginners, means giving up of understanding the social world. Okay. We must learn to differentiate between the personal observation that we produce in our everyday life while walking in the street, while talking with friends, from the ethnographic observation. Daily observations and comments could be more or less sophisticated and subtle. It depends on our perception and general intelligence, let's say, but they are not a product of a qualitative methodology. Often, in fact, they are founded by our unconscious prejudices, which are part of our nature as social beings with particular identities and roles in our society. We can't forget this. We must practice the analytical and conceptual reflexivity in observation. What does that mean? Well, the language we use to classify the world, to classify the people, to classify the practices is based on our perspective as particular actors. In my case, my position in the structure of society as, in my case, a middle class, white, heterosexual, cis male with higher education of middle class means that I have a particular worldview and I use a set of words and expressions to typify, to classify the others. The place from where we are talking is relevant because perhaps we may be reproducing some visions about other social groups. That's why the words we use in our writing, during fieldwork, in our observations and descriptions could seem neutral and innocent to us. However, we often use terms that not only could be offensive to people we are studying, but even more important, we also could lead us to analytical reduction. For instance, if we are using terms like homeless or immigrant in our descriptions, we must be aware of what this word means, which is the origin of this word. We are not just reducing these people, homeless people, if we talk in these terms, to a particular dimension outlined by this word, but we are also reinforcing institutional labels used from the perspective of, for example, police or the church or social assistance or the press. These are words that has their genealogies, and when we use these words, we must be conscious. The words we use are also at the service of building reality. When we are writing, we are building reality. So which reality we want to build when doing descriptions, which is our role when reinforcing these categories during the film. With that said, we can now think about the main techniques of writing down notes, which I think that it could be very useful to you. Sometimes we cannot take our notes because of the sensitivity of the setting, because in the setting we are doing participant observation and some people don't like we are taking notes, or because we are doing a real participation and we are doing some tasks at the same time. We are helping others to organize a festival and we just cannot take notes. In these cases, memory techniques could be useful. For instance, we can create, it's very usual to train our memory, creating mental chronologies. Of course, that those who has better memories can do better registering. For example, Jordi Nofra here, I did fieldwork with Jordi, and Jordi, it's amazing. He has an incredible memory. But for those who don't have this privilege, we can create these mental chronologies, gathering, organizing all the observed events, and even the movements of social actors in the space, like it's a theater piece. After the fieldwork, it's necessary to write down these mental notes in a fixed record. However, in the most part of cases, we can take notes naturally. It is important, and this is counterintuitive, it is important to write down just the necessary information. We cannot write all the time, writing all the time. Why? Because we must spend more time observing than writing down. And in this sense, we can use, for example, abbreviations. Abbreviations, a system of abbreviations that will be improved during the course of our research. We will start with initials for the most important social actors, using the first initial of their name. And then we create also keywords for these events and practices that usually in the context we are familiar with this practice, and we are briefing all this thing that is happening in just a keyword. As the same as with mental notes, we will write down an extended version of this abbreviation when abandoning the setting. Of course, that new technologies will help a lot. We have now cell phones that are little computers in our pockets where we can register our voice notes. For example, when walking home after the fieldwork, we can take the phone and make a note with all the observation. Or even we can do a little undercover research using the phone, like talking to someone, but we are actually recording a note. two rules must be applied, even when we have involved electronic methods for registering data. To manual work is unavoidable. First rule, passing our mental abbreviated voice notes or electronic notes as soon as possible to a fixed record, to a Word document, or if you prefer to write with a pen, even better. Extending them with our memory. It's important to reconstruct this abbreviation, reconstruct these mental notes with more details, because we have the brain in these first hours with a very a huge amount of details that are flourishing in our mind in these first hours. This is important because the forgetting of details run very quickly. And the second rule is that we must apply time, we must apply exactitude, details, and discipline in elaborating our writing. This moment when we pass this register to the fixed record, because this is the main source of information, of data in ethnographic observation. Let's talk about the content of the notes. What's the writing? What's the content of this writing that we are registering all the time? Our model, even historically, the model for ethnography is the work of naturalists, the biologists of nature that observe individual and collective behavior of a species in its natural environment. The same as these biologists, we need a protocol. We need a protocol to organize, to systematize our observations. For instance, a classic question: how long should the observation last? If we are doing a prolonged and diversified observation, we can be more aware of which are the common practices of any given social group. This is obvious. In short, we must visit the field, our venue, our area, in different hours and days until understanding the internal regularities of this place, and also to assist the extraordinary and cyclic events that happen in the social group or in the social space. This is a general rule to this protocol. Well, it is possible to indicate 5 different kind of registers in terms of the content of the notes. First one, the direct observations. The most part of notes must be in this category and should be specific, descriptive, and this time neutral, indicating just what's going on in the observational space regarding the social actors, their places, and the practices and roles they are developing. We will write also the hour of each observation and entry of each observation, indicating also this entering and exit of social actors in the space of observation. Again, the model of the theater piece. Social life is like a theater. It's people with their roles and their functions. So we must think about this idea of describing some sort of piece of theater or cinema. And also, we must write down memory notes to remember later something that we heard or something that we see, and we have no time now to write down. A second kind of register are the analytical ideas. In parallel with this regular observation, it is common, very often we are inspired by the flux of the events, and we start to think in a more abstract, more analytical way. We start to think about concepts we wrote in the books and in the articles about sociological, anthropological, philosophical concepts. It is necessary to register this also, all we are thinking. Later, we will have time to get rid of useless ideas, but at the moment, we write down all, okay? This is our notebook. It's like a very wild place to write. We have to write everything. The third kind of note is the feelings and impressions. During the observation, it's also common to produce personal opinions, judgments about what's going on or about the people in the setting. All these comments must be registered in order to control our own prejudices, as we see before, to make them visible in our work and then to balance them. Also, this register could be used later. during the interviews, for example, to confront people with their behavior, with the actions we see they do, and also obtaining the meaning of their actions. So it's important also this. Maps and drawing. The elaboration of maps is an important element to visualize these close relationships, a relationship between social actors, practices, and space, which is central for urban ethnography. From the beginning of the discipline, and I'm talking now about anthropology, maps and also designs were very common in ethnographies as an important auxiliary register. The map, you can imagine this map of the small village where Malinowski was doing his research, the position of different gangs in the street in the works of the Chicago School, or the designs of material culture gathered of any society. Regarding the crafting of maps, this was a methodology I intended to teach you in the field, because it involves basically, in the case of Nightlife, give to the night users the opportunity to draw their own cognitive maps, to see how they imagine the space, the size of the area, the distances between the bars, the routes they take during the night. We can also use, in the case of Nightlife fieldwork, real maps to ask the night users to mark and indicate their favorite spots and venues, the usual routes that people take from one place to another in a regular night, and so on. The same as photography, also, maps could be used to evoke, to bring forth a conversation about particular venues or nightlife habits or night behavior and so on. This process is called elicitation, using a map for the people to start talking about something that we are interested in. Also related with maps and movement, and also a technique that we want to offer you in this field trip, we have the walking methodologies. We also had some presentations of walking methodologies these days. I think that on Thursday we had two in the methods panel. Walking methodologies are especially suitable for nightlife ethnographies. We can make interviews while walking or following a group of people from bar to bar. Again, with Jordi, we did some sort of work with pub crawlers. In the case of walking conversations, people often give us information regarding their habits and perceptions through the space that they are not able to communicate inside a bar because they are not conscious in this moment about this behavior. Following a group through different spaces not only allow us to do proper participant observation as pub crawlers, but inform us about the patterns of consumption of particular groups, or also to verify routes and understand the nightlife geographies. So these walking methodologies at night are paramount and are very used for many scholars. And the five kind of register are the description of places and objects. This time, following another inspiration in the 19th century of anthropology is the realist literature and the naturalist literature of the 19th century, where places and objects are somehow linked, related to the surrounding social life. They are materialization of social relationships. We can read this in the realist literature. For example, when we are doing an interview in a house, the family portraits in domestic spaces. They are talking about social realities. Or in the case of Nightlife, the political or identity signs and references in the walls of an association or a bar. These are informations that deserve to be described in our notes because they are giving us an information that is here beyond the information given by the alive actors. Let's say that. Well, another question is, how do we organize all this information, all this variated information in our notebook? Well, I have a common advice, which is to divide our notebook into two parts. In the right pages, the pages on the right, we can write down our collected data, the most objective and neutral work, the direct observations, the maps, and the descriptions of places and objects. Okay, this information that don't include the impressions and the feelings. In the other side, in the left part, and at the same time, we can write down our impressions, our feelings, including the auto-analysis I explained at the beginning, and also our analytical ideas, our hypotheses, the theoretical questions. In this way, we have a tracking down in one side of the most objective process of gathering data, and in the other, the interpretations, the theories we are thinking about, our impressions about the social actors and what's going on in the field. Ideally, we can confront side to side, and we see the correspondence between these direct observations and what we are thinking about this. Okay, this is the idea of dividing the notebook. Well, I will present you now, because I see that I can do that. I will present you now the observable units of social life. Okay, this is a useful classification of phenomena that we encounter in the field, elaborated from the perspective of naturalism in social science, and that could be useful to write down notes. We will present these units in an increasing scale of complexity, from the most simple to the most complex of phenomena, according always with this naturalistic gaze to social life. More or less as a set of Russian dolls. So in each presented unit, we can find inside the formula. Well, you will understand. First of all, the meanings. These are not actually observable. These are the most controversial and intangible forms of social life. The meanings are the beliefs, are the ideologies, the opinions, the discourses, and they are built and shared collectively. When we can see or more find these meanings, well, we can find these meanings when asking people about the meaning of their actions. We must be careful with meanings because they work as discourses, okay, as worldviews. So people often express what they think must be expressed when asked for meanings. Do you understand? I mean, as sociologists or anthropologists, we cannot know never what people actually think. Okay, this is materially impossible. We only know what people say they think. And this is mediated and affected by the social relations, by the context and the people who is asking, which is us, by the historical and political context, and so on. So the meanings are here, but forget for a moment the meanings, okay? Because the next observable units are the important ones. The practices. This is the minimum unity of observable human behavior. These are activities that are seen by the participants as irrelevant, as common, as typical of everyday life. However, it is important to notice that any given society is just the exact count of all these practices, of all its practices. In other words, the continuity, the existence of any given society is the accumulation of all its practices. It's it's the possibility for any society to continue existing. Walking, looking, talking are practices, okay, observable practices. Without them, there's no society that can longer exist. And also, each society do practices differently. Okay, practice is the basic unit of our observation, of us to observe. Episodes. All the contexts and social settings when we are doing fieldwork have a state of normality, of stability, where all the things happen in some sort of pre-established direction, a known direction by the social actors. But from time to time, in any setting, occur an episode where normality is disrupted. Normality is come to an end. Social actors, practices, spaces reorganize themselves and adjust for some time. This is exceptional moments. These emerging events could be a police persecution in a street, but also a festivity, a popular festival, or a political demonstration, or even the automatic reorganization of people reacting to an earthquake. This is an episode. This is an irresistible event. The meetings. A meeting is the minimum unity of socialization between two or more people that are in the immediate presence, focalized in a common or mutual activity, talking, fighting, working together. This is a meeting. These meetings can last from seconds to hours and often begin with a ritual of salutation and finalize with the corresponding ritual of farewell. Some meetings are a job interview. Job interview is a meeting, a conversation in the elevator, a violent argument. It's not necessary to be positive meeting, or the brief relationship we establish with a shopkeeper when we go to buy something in a shop. Another observable element, very useful to understand what we do in the fieldwork, actors and their roles. We define and describe actors through the social categories that are attributed to them in some moment of their existence, and that can be negotiated, transformed, abandoned during the life course. Okay, this is useful to understand how we write about people. There exist formal roles such as gender, nationality, occupation, or age, which are normally the first way for us to write about them. Depending on our perception and writing skills in understanding and describing people, we can also attribute to them informal roles depending on their personality, on their behavior. It depends on our skill in writing this. Relationships. You can see that the complexity is coming to is increasing in each unit I am presenting. Relationships, two individuals that interact with each other with regularity in a relatively extended time frame and that consider themselves as connected in any sense, they have a relationship. In a relationship, the level of interdependence, of power, of trust between the parts could be extremely variable. We have relationships, friendships, bureaucratic relationships, threatening relationships, loving relationships, will relationships. The groups, we continue to increase the complexity of these unities, observable units. It's the same that relationships in the definition, a group of people that interact with each other with regularity in a relatively extended time frame and consider themselves connected in any sense, this time considering themselves as an us, are a social group. Friends, family, street gangs, work colleagues are examples of groups. Groups are generally structured by some formal or informal hierarchies, more or less severe, and by different kinds of relationships between the members. See, like in each observable unit, we can find the former. The organizations, more complexity, they are collectivities united by a formal and declared objective. They suffer stages of growing, instability. They can even disappear. Organizations have strategies to reach their declared objectives and use their members to achieve particular, sometimes specialized tasks. Political parties are organizations. Hospitals function as organizations. Students' associations, religious cults, and bars and clubs must be treated as organizations from this perspective of naturalism in social science. And finally, the settlements. The settlements are a set of all the former unities in a particular space. Blocks of houses, neighborhoods, villages, small towns, ghettos, and also areas of nightlife could be treated as settlements because contain in a particular space all the former unities. Cities as such are not operative for observation. Nobody do an ethnography of Lisbon. It's too much big. We do ethnographies in particular spaces of Lisbon. So during the fieldwork, we are not just identifying these units and reporting where and when and how they emerge. We are also thinking about their nature with a set of systematic questions. We put questions over these units to start to describe the complexity of these units. First of all, what I'm looking at, this is the basic question. Is this that I am looking a relation? This people is part of a group, is part of an organization. This practice is part of a meeting. What's the meaning of this practice for the social actors? Second question, how can I categorize the unit I'm looking at? Here we will characterize the unit according with their attributes. We are giving adjectives to better describe in a new layer of interpretation the units we are looking at. For example, a looking of acceptance. Here we are interpreting, we are looking at practice which is a looking of acceptance. An uncomfortable meeting. We perceive that this meeting is uncomfortable. We start to use objectives to interpret our data. A restricted group, an efficient organization, a stigmatized neighborhood. This is the first layer of our interpretation, and it's very important and shows the maturity of our capacity to analyze social data. What's the unit's structure? From the size of a group, so groups, organizations, settlements, the unit presents an internal structure. For example, models of authority and leadership. We all know that even a group of friends, there is a model of leadership inside. Or a political party, there's a segmentation into differentiated functions, there's a structure, there's mechanisms for spreading the rules and the norms among the members, or to control the information circulating inside the groups, the organizations of the settlement. So it's important to start to understand our data, asking ourselves for the unit structure. What's the unit's frequency? Is this unit a common presence in the context? Which is the frequency? How many times, for example, a meaning appears in the discourse of social actors? How many times? How many times we can observe a practice in a particular space? This is talking us about the qualities of this particular space. If we observe very much this practice, which is repeated in many occurrences. For example, how many bars with bouncers exist in this nightlife area, and how many bars without bouncers exist in this nightlife area. So the unit's frequency teach us something about the social world. Which are the unit's causes and consequences? As we already learned, observation cannot provide straight responses to causal questions, but can point to correlations, to factors, to processes which are happening in course. For example, a particular meaning could be associated with the marginalization of a social group, which is what happens with racist narratives, for instance. Which are the unit's processes? Units have a structure of internal transformation based on time. They evolve. We can identify, for example, the moments of a meeting, the stages of an organization, the cyclical returning of episodes, such as the local festivities, or in nightlife, the St. Patrick's Day, for example, in nightlife is an important repetition. In all cases, these sequences are interesting because are linked to the historical nature of live units. Finally, which are the unit's strategies? Which are the objectives that units are seeking for? In each social unit exist actors, exist groups and organizations that have their own agendas regarding the present and the future. In the insight of each social situation, we can see how people produce and reproduce society, choosing between continuity and change. So I have been presenting this layout to observe in social settings, which is closely linked to a particular tendency in sociology and anthropology, which is the naturalistic view of social life, embraced by several authors, mainly sociologists, Erving Goffman, Herbert Blumer, Linan, and John Lovelock. However, there's realities much more difficult to render into this naturalistic gaze, such as the macro analysis and categories of social science provided by Marxism, structuralism, decolonialism, feminism, and so on. We have no time now to enter in how we adapt, how we jump from this theory, from these naturalistic details of social life. So I want to now start with another part, which is the interview. Okay. Let's see. Okay. I will talk to you about interviewing, but we have no much time. So, what do you think, Jordi Manuel? What do you think about me talking for more half an hour? It's too much.
Maybe let's see. I mean,
I don't know.
Yeah. Or I can ask all participants to say in the chat if they agree.
Maybe they are
There
afraid.
are some people in different time zones, you know.
Yeah, I can see the comments. I don't know what the people is saying.
Christian said that's fine. Okay, that's fine for me too. Alison says okay. Okay.
This is a short part. Okay. Let's go.
Robert says okay. Okay, Danny, more how? Yeah.
Venga, pues, okay. So, formal and informal interviews are the necessary complement of any observation. Some aspects will be accessible to our gaze, to our observation, while others, such as the meanings, remember these meanings we saw, will be invisible and only unveiled through a conversation. It is called ethnographic interview because the interview must be connected to the remaining pieces of our ethnography. It is not an isolated methodology ready to apply in any case. That's why a very common mistake is to make the same aseptic closed interview during all the fieldwork, disconnected from the observations and the opinions that we have been collecting during the field. Mixing together our discoveries, our perceptions during observation with our informal perspectives in the interview, it's the ground for a deep ethnography, for a vibrant ethnography. How many interviews we must do in order to obtain some representativity? This is a common mistake. This is not quantitative research where we need to obtain enough cases to make valid affirmations. Sometimes researchers make 50 interviews to important people in the field with the same questions, which resembles a survey. But this is not an ethnographic interview because we usually obtain the same kind of responses this way, reducing the particularity of each case. For us, in ethnography, interviews and conversations must be another way to understand, to get inside the social world, and to give to participants a space to talk freely. Interviews and conversations are, first of all, a social interaction. It is not just about collecting facts aseptically and acritically as in a transaction of data. The driving force of an interview is the particular relationship between two individuals. However, we are not interviewing just an individual isolated position. People are in society. They represent the discourses of particular institutions. They support or reject certain political perspectives. They are representative or not of particular social groups, and so on. In short, we must understand the context of people, and that's why we mix together our observations, the interviews, and also other perspectives such as journalism and also the previous social analysis on the issue. We often differentiate between informal conversations and interviews. Informal conversations take place during the action, when we see a window of opportunity to ask for something related with our interests that is happening in this precise moment. This individual there, which is passing by, who is this guy? This particular course of action we are looking, why is this guy doing that? usually these information can be obtained only then, because the emerging situation demands an explanation, and we can ask for this explanation. And sometimes it's impossible to obtain this kind of information in a formal interview. Informal conversations are usually short, interrupted by any other events going on in the field, or because we have only a couple of questions and we don't want to squeeze our informants. In an ethnography, informal conversations are part of observation, are the piece of meaning and comprehension that complement our observations and opinions. The main difference with informal conversations is that interviews must be recorded. If we are not recording, we are losing tons of information regarding not only the many details and data that we are not able to write down during a speech because it's impossible, but also the social interaction material of the interview as such, the non-verbal communication, the pauses, the hesitations, the changes of tone, and so on. The next step is to choose and seduce people to interview. Important people to interview are the gatekeepers. Okay, we talk about the gatekeepers, the most institutional individuals, the people in charge. Sometimes they offer us interviews with no interest at all, because they are usually the gatekeepers protecting themselves and the people they represent from the threat that we represent, an outsider asking questions. In any case, interview them is important to recognize them as important people, as people in charge. Many times our work will be easier because of that, because even with an interview which was unsubstantial, they are opening doors, they are gatekeepers. So after the interview, this will help us to reach other important people that maybe offer us more interesting interviews. But we still have to attract people to interviews, and this is not always easy. When we want to engage people from an informal conversation to a formal interview, it's difficult because they already talk with us, and the most part of people don't understand why we want more information. We already talked to you. What do you want? There's a risk. They step down from further inquiry for the interview. In order to secure people that we know in the fieldwork for a formal interview, we follow some rules. Explain that we need at least 1 hour with them. This is not a superficial 15-minute survey. It's more like a calm conversation with no distractions around about their lives regarding whatever we are studying, around this place, around the subject. However, we will clear our agendas at least for 2 hours in each interview, because we need at least one to gain the trust of people and obtain the better information. But sometimes people get confident later and give us much more information. Second advice is to arrange the meeting as soon as possible, when the memories of the meeting for the first time, this informal conversation, are still fresh. We don't push with the details on a day or a place. We must be aware of for the people it's important to be comfortable, to be confident with this moment of encounter. However, we cannot make the interview where other people involved in the social world could be listening, okay? We need this time, we need to isolate them from their social world to assure that their responses are not affected by others. People, an example in the nightlife, we cannot interview a worker of the bar in front of the boss of the bar. This is absurd. Finally, we remind the meeting the day before, because some people in the last hours decide not to meet with us with some excuse caused by the embarrassment or the fear or the laziness. Especially vulnerable people could be very reluctant to meet with us because they are stigmatized and they are scared of the consequences of talking about their illicit activities, for instance. The success of the interview relies strongly to our openness. What I'm saying that because it's good to have specific questions to ask, because we need to focus around 4 or 5 big issues we care about. The problem here is to present the interview with a linear, strict, and closed structure. Okay, the famous list of questions. A visible list of questions, visible for the interviewee, is absolutely wrong because it resembles a survey and people will act in consequence. That's it, with urgency to follow from one question to another and finally to finish the survey, because of a survey, it's a timeline. But it's even worse. People could be repressing any other comments they would have or they would do because don't fit with any particular question, and it's lethal for our interview. And like this, we have to announce at the beginning that we want to hear all things considered relevant by the participant without limits, without order or urgency. We will bring with us this notebook, our notebook, with some issues we want to tackle. But we won't look at the notebook all the time to bring more questions as we are reading a survey. The situations must be more like a conversation. And we must write down in the notebook people, places, events that show up in the conversation to ask later for them, because we won't interrupt the stream of the conversation. The strict following of an outline of questions, and I want to insist in this idea, prevent interviewees to express their experiences as they are lived by them. And like this, we should favor the conditions for the rising of the participant ideas of the world we are studying. And often our questions are like restricting chains for that to happen. Okay, if we are worried for the responses, specific responses, we are absent from the situation of empathy we want to create with the participants. Let's see how to manage with the different stages of the interview, and this is the last part of this presentation. First of all, we should present briefly the research and ourselves, starting then with a first easy question or issue to contextualize the interviewee with our general issue. Usually, it's just asking about the reason that led us to the interview. It's easy. Just explain me the relationship that you have with the place or the issue. Like, so when you started to frequent this bar, this is an opening question. From then on, we will ask questions, or we introduce comments in order to make the participant feel useful and informed, asking for basic things that usually we already know. Is the foundation for make them comfortable and going further later. We don't interrupt, we don't contradict, we don't change the matter at this point because we want them to feel confident. We can ask for details or specific examples, but always sympathizing with the respondent. Sometimes happens that they ask something to us that could be controversial. Then we will try to dodge the question and keep our opinions for ourselves. If everything is going fine, the interviewee will finally open to us. They will go from informative explanation to the personal involvement to the matter. They will give us impressions, perspectives, feelings, experiences about the relation with the issue. We are in this moment earning their trust, so we can start to speak more naturally, going deeply towards more controversial questions, asking for remarks and insinuations made before, and clarifying general important things. In short, we are going from a passive attitude to an active attitude with the interviewee. Almost at the end, and this is the last phase of an interview, the interviewee reaches a state of full liberation. Around the 2 hours, sometimes before that, it depends completely on this interaction, which is the interview, people don't care anymore of us being strangers recording the conversation, and they will say things that never would say at the beginning. We are generally tired because listening actively as we do in an ethnographic interview is really exhausting. But this is the richer moment, so we must take advantage of this and continue the conversation. After the interview, we have some tasks to do. First, evaluate our interview in order to improve our performance in the future. We need to do something different the next time. Second, registering the findings. We have to incorporate to the research the new findings, new people to contact, new perspective on the matter, and new orientations in the field. And finally, we have to register all about the place, the circumstances, the context in the interview, In the case where we were in their home, for example, in an association or any other significant place, we must write down about this context of the interview. Well, now I'm finishing with a brief section about analyzing data. The first principle is that there is no separate stage for the analysis. We are analyzing all the time, especially during the process of collecting data, when we select and organize a huge amount of data, the most interesting notions and issues. This is a result of a first analysis. Like when we are searching in internet for an unknown matter for us, and we privilege certain articles, certain sources, this criteria we are using is product of our thinking, is some sort of an analytical process. It happens the same with the documentation. We are all the time documenting in the analytical nature of ethnography. However, we must admit that at the end we have to write something. We have to do some tasks, especially with our notebook. First of all, reconstructing chronologically our research, what we did, who we knew, the events we saw, and then we situate it in a chronological line. This is very useful and extremely mandatory to do after our research. Second, classifying the different units in a thematic manner, grouping together the observations, the interviews, and the documents thematically to start to see some relevant issues. Creating a brief description of each research participant, of the people. In the past, we used cards, little cards, for example, to classify the social actors we interacted with and having them very present during the analysis. And finally, analyzing the most important elements among our data. There's always relevant pieces that we know that are key to a start, especially interviews. And there's always this interview where these particular social actors give us a huge amount of information that help us to understand a critical thing we are researching. The main problem when we start to organize our data is that in a single register, for example, a transcribed interview, we will find hundreds of different references to many matters interesting to us. But we often want to group them thematically using codes and see all the references about an issue in a single look. How we do that? How we take this transcription of an interview and take references and classify from this document. In the past, we did photocopies of the same transcription and classify in different folders and subfolders according with different issues and interests. And we will finish telling you that there is a modern way of do that, which are the Cactus software packages that help us to do that. Cactus means computer-assisted qualitative data analysis software, and provide us with a structure to organize all our data, including especially multimedia. In Cactus, we can put notes on any kind of file and exploring relationships between data. Well, this is, I have no time to talk about Cactus. Let me say just that there is a Cactus networking project. You can write in your computers Cactus networking project, and you will find a project of the University of Surrey that they have reviews of different software packages, and you can learn more about this fantastic way of organizing our data. And so this is all by my side. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and learned something about the foundations of ethnography.